Hey VC, it's Mazzy here, and I want to showcase some of my 60s British Invasion collection. You all know I'm the Beatle collector, Beatle freak, Beatle fan, and I just want to show you a bunch of records that I bought in the day because of the Beatles and that whole invasion. I mean, obviously, those of us of a certain age remember it so vividly, and it just changed everything. I mean, one day you're into Little League and baseball and something else, and all of a sudden you're into rock and roll and the Beatles and the Fabs and everything connected to it. And then there was an avalanche of groups coming to America, going on the Ed Sullivan Show, going on all the other, the few television shows that were related to music. In fact, there weren't many, but they were just on the radio all the time. Anything you could, they could lap up with Beats and Beatles and Liverpool and then London and the whole Merseyside thing. So I just want to show you some of my records. I'm not going to tell you the whole history, you know it, but I want to start out with this record. The Beatle Beat, I Want to Hold Your Hand, The Bugs. One of my very first VCs about a year ago or so was about my Beatle cover band collection, cover albums. I was very new to VC. I probably don't have a lot of subscribers, so if this interests you, go way back into the Maslov archive here and watch that video. It was done here in the Mazzy's library, and I went through showing covers of all these bands and artists and singers that covered Beatles songs. And anyway, go check it out. But anyway, I probably said on that video, which I'm going to say, the reason I'm showing this first is because as soon as I heard I Want to Hold Your Hand on the radio in 1964, I asked my mother if she would get me the record. And she worked in a department store, big department store called the Emporium, which was a California chain, I believe. And they had a record department, with all the listening booths and stuff. So she comes back home one day at work and brings me this. The Beatle Beat featuring I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Bugs. Well, everybody was cashing in on the Beatles, and as quickly as possible. So they found groups, and this is actually, I think, the original Liverpool sound, recorded in England. I don't even know if they're British. Nobody knows who these people were, but look at that photograph. It kind of emulated the Robert Freeman cover they did on With the Beatles and Meet the Beatles. And so, of course, when I told her that's the wrong album, Mom, she just said, I'll just keep it. And then, obviously, the next day, I believe, she brought me home this record and this exact copy, my mono copy of Meet the Beatles. And the rest is history, and I fell in love, and my life was literally changed overnight, or at least over that period of February 1964. But that was quite a year. It's 1964, all these bands come in. I'm going to show you some records. I'm going to only show you these because they put out so many records in '64. And what I love about this record, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing about the Capitol American records were different than the way the Beatles intended. All those of us that grew up, these are the albums we grew up with in America. And yes, Dave Dexter Jr. at Capitol Record added reverb and cut the records, and what they did is they put out 3 records for every 2 albums the Beatles actually made, and really skimmed it down to 12 songs instead of 14 songs from the British counterpart. But the main reason I want to show this, just briefly, and these are the only Beatle records I'm going to show. This is not a Beatle video per se. In fact, it's just a launching pad for all the other records I'm going to show. But this record is really a great rock and roll record. There are a lot of covers. I mean, Roll Over Beethoven, You Really Got a Hold on Me, Devil in Your Heart, Money, Long Tall Sally, Please Mr. Postman. So 6 of the songs, almost half the songs, are cover songs. A lot of the staples that the Beatles did during their whole Hamburg days and Liverpool days at the Cavern and all those things. So great record. It's been there's a Yo La Tengo album that emulated this cover. There's a couple bands that copied this cover. But this, I would argue, is a great, great rock and roll album, and so great that the rock critic and writer Dave Marsh, who has rock and roll journals, rock and rap journals, a newsletter, website, and he used to work for Rolling Stones, written a lot of books on Bruce Springsteen and the 500 greatest rock and roll records or rock records for Rolling Stone magazine. Wrote this book about, 15 years ago maybe. It's almost like a thesis, and it's called The Beatles' Second Album. And it's a read you could read one weekend. Cream editor and best-selling author, The Beatles' Second Album. And he writes this: with the Beatles' second album runs only 22 minutes with 11 songs, many of which the group didn't write. Despite that, the album personifies the Beatles, the world's greatest rock and roll band, according to rock and roll critic Dave Marsh. Basically, he makes the argument and discusses how this is one of the greatest rock and roll albums the Beatles did, and definitely one of the great 60s rock and roll albums. And I would kind of agree with that. So, if you ever check this book out, maybe there's a Kindle or online edition, but it's a fun read if you want to read about, and know about the history of the whole, bastardization by Capitol Records of the Beatles catalog. But that's what we knew up until Sgt. Pepper. And then Sgt. Pepper on, everything equaled. And then in the 80s when the CDs came out and we changed over to CDs, Capitol switched everything to the British edition. You all probably know that, but some of you newer record buyers and are new to the Beatles might not. But during this early time, this very, very early time, in 1964, 63, 64, it was just a rush of putting product out that even the faintest tenuous connection to the Beatles. Murray the K. This was Murray the K, the fifth Beatle. He was the DJ that actually met with the Beatles, played their records. They called him the fifth Beatle. He introduced them a lot of their first shows. Kind of an interesting collection. This is an album of him putting his favorite rock and roll songs, but songs like the Shirelles, the Kingsmen, the Drifters, Dinah Warwick, Jan Brady, but of course, the whole marketing is the fifth Beatle. It has nothing to fucking do with the Beatles. But of course, guess who bought it? And I'm not the only one. Here's another one. The original greatest hits. Who do you think this is? Who fucking knows? It doesn't even say. Beatles songs. Who knows? The greatest hits. The original greatest hits. Yeah, but not the original artist. It's on GRC 1001, Greatest Records, 1964. So their first record, someone put out a cover record, I don't even remember this record, of somebody doing Beatles songs. Okay. And then there's another label that I had, Pickwick. Pickwick is a infamous budget label, but look at these two things. Beats and Beat-A-Mania. It doesn't say Beatlemania, it says Beat-A-Mania. And then lastly, who could not forget this record? But this is one that I actually bought and I loved. The Chipmunks, Dave Seville, Alvin Simon Theater doing the Beatles songs. Love it. Anyway, okay, the British invasion. Actually, in the background right now is Cilla Black. Cilla Black was one of the artists that Brian Epstein, who was the Beatles manager, managed. He had a whole stable of artists. Once the Beatles hit, producers, promoters in the States and elsewhere really wanted Beatle product, and if they couldn't have Beatle product, they wanted anyone that, any three guys that played guitar with a drummer, basically that same thing. So I'm going to showcase some groups that made it, a couple of others, and a few collections. But Cilla Black was a singer. I think she was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and she did some things. She didn't really break huge in America. But Petula Clark, in a way, was sort of the one not related to the Beatles, but that whole British artist that in '65 really kind of clicked here. But Cilla Black had a big following in the UK. So Is It Love? But again, Lennon and McCartney wrote a lot of songs. They were so prolific. A lot of these artists, especially the Brian Epstein stable, they were funneling songs that the Beatles kind of considered throwaways to them, and all these other artists would record them. In fact, what we have in the background that I'm playing now is this. And if you can find this, grab it. It's the songs that Lennon and McCartney gave away. It's got, actually it starts with I'm the Greatest. John Lennon wrote for Ringo Starr on his first Capitol rock and roll solo album after he did his, 73 actually, after he did his country and retro big band album. But it also has Billy J. Kramer, Peter and Gordon, Applejack, songs like From a Window, 1 and 1 is 2, Nobody I Know, I'll Keep You Satisfied, Woman. And I'll go in that when I show some individual records. But this is an import. There's a CD version of it. It's really kind of a nice collection, and you really get a great sense of these other wonderful songs, some of which turned up Beatles demo versions on the anthology series. So another kind of record that just came out at the time Capitol put out, Where It All Began, Picture of the Liverpool. So just, again, it's grabbing onto the whole Liverpool Merseybeat sound right there. But it's MC is Bob Wooler, who was the DJ at the Cavern Club back in the day. And it has people I've never heard of, the Michael Allen Group, the Richmond Group, and Earl Preston Realms. So there was a lot of these Liverpudlian Merseybeat groups that really didn't make it. In fact, I probably should have showed these first, because these two collections are UK collections. They came out in the 70s, and they really gathered together a lot of the bands that were big in the Liverpool Mersey scene in 62, 63, 64, and beyond that never really made it here. In this one, it has Fair and Flamingos, the Merseybeats, the Searchers. They made it. The Big Three were one of the biggest bands in Liverpool. They never really crossed the Atlantic. Sonny Webb and the Cascade, the Undertakers. Some of you have heard King Size Taylor and the Dominoes, Freddie Starr and the Midnighters, the Mojos, Roy Storm and the Hurricanes, which was the band that Ringo Starr played drums in. But this was great because this is, again, this came out around 74, 75, this collection. And it has a reproduction of the Merseybeat. Bill Harry was the editor, publisher of the Merseybeat, which was the Liverpool band. And you see a reproduction behind me, a larger one, that came out, that really showcased all the artists. This is an edition from February 64, The Searchers Return. So it's really about pop music in Liverpool, and it was the sort of music publication in there. But this is a great mono collection, just great kind of the whole beat scene going on there in Liverpool. And this is another one, the Beat Merchants, British beat groups, not just Liverpool, and a great another double collection. So if you're into that kind of music, a lot of these are the more rock and roll-y kind of collections, kind of the music the Beatles did early on during their Hamburg and Cavern Club days. And again, a lot of the songs that are on that Beatles second album I just showed. So again, I'm going in circles here, but the Big Three were one of the biggest bands in Liverpool at the time, and they never really kind of came to America, never were popular here. But one of the songs that a lot of the groups did, called Some Other Guy, you've heard it, the Beatles do it on one of the Cavern Club early films, great song. And this was released by the Big Three on Decca in March 1963. But they did all these bands did cover songs. You know, What I Say, Zippity Doo Dah, Reelin' and Rockin', Cavern Stomp, Peanut Butter. I mean, it was all about, you know, the rock and roll songs, and a lot of these bands kept doing all the same songs over and over again and shared that. So in terms of the now we're talking about some of the whole British invasions. One of the other early big ones was Gerry and the Pacemakers, and Don't Let the Sun Catch You Crying was a huge hit, along with his song Ferry Across the Mersey. And like everyone else, like all these, you know, Once Hard Day's Night was big and everything, they clamored to make movies. So Gerry and the Pacemakers, there's a movie made. George Martin was the music director on this. It's interesting how he gets his name on the cover because of the Beatles, obviously, but there was a sort of a movie about them in Liverpool. But Gerry, in my opinion, Gerry Marsden was one of the great also songwriters of Liverpool. But beyond this, I'm really surprised that he never went on, even with solo work, and put out some really creative ongoing albums here in this country. He was still big, he stayed in Liverpool, maybe that was it. You know, you stay where your hometown. Especially in the 60s, you really had to get out, go to London, and go to the world, even though he came to America early on during those early beat, you know, British invasion tours. Gerry and the Pacemakers, a greatest hits, another best of Gerry and the Pacemakers. And then there was a group, Freddie and the Dreamers, which in a way, I consider them sort of a novelty British group. I'm telling you now, do the Freddie. Freddie, he had sort of this manic, almost like wackadoodle dance called the Freddie. In a way, he was like the Jerry Lewis of the British invasion. They didn't really last long. Anyway, I don't even, you know, these early bands, and the problem was that their albums had great singles, and then they had a lot of filler. You know, they weren't like the Beatles that really every song pretty much was great. I Keep You Satisfied, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. Really big, again, another band that really kind of got big because of songs written by the Beatles. I'll Keep You Satisfied, From a Window, I Call Your Name. There's like, I'll Be on My Way. This album alone has 4 Lennon and McCartney songs. And he was really sold as the kind of the pretty boy at the time too. Trains and Boats and Planes. Another one. And then a Capitol reissue years later. This is probably in the 70s. Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, with the Dakotas, and has a lot of the hits and the Lennon McCartney hits again. So another band that was really big, and one of my favorites was the Searchers. This is an early recordings from the Star Club in Germany, where the Beatles played a lot during their Hamburg days. A lot of bands. Star Club was a big band in Hamburg, Germany. But this is, again, a 70s reissue of kind of funky tapes. If you've heard the Beatles Star Club tapes, you know what I'm talking about. They weren't really great fidelity, but historically, to me, historically, they're really important. Love it, love it, love it. Needles and Pins, remember Needles and Pins? Great song. Probably their most famous song. In fact, it is their most famous song. Needles and Pins. And if you want to know details about them, how tall they are, their height, their weights, their hair, their eyes. I don't know why people needed to know the waist size, the heights, the color of eyes of musicians, but that was sort of the whole, you know, pop thing for the girls, girl fans mostly, I think, maybe. I don't really think I cared about that, but I don't remember. And then these are 2 collections that came out. The Pie History of British Music, Pie Records, put out these comps in the 70s, and I would pick them up. You know, they sold pretty well. I think originally, also Sire Records distributed some of these later on, as I believe. The thing about the Searchers, I really like the Searchers, and they actually had a sort of a renaissance in 1979 through about 81. They put out several albums that, unfortunately, I need to get. I don't have them. I used to have them, but in my big purge of the 90s, I lost them, or I got rid of them. But they had a resurgence of sort of the new wavy kind of rock and roll thing. Some really good albums on Sire Records of the Searchers. Okay, then there were these 2 groups that some people couldn't tell apart. You know, the whole duo folk scene. I'd say 2 guys in acoustic guitars that looked like the Beatles in a way, or college students. Chad and Jeremy. Chad and Jeremy. Let's see here. Chad Stewart and Jeremy Clyde made some great records. Great Summer Song. Summer Song was the biggest hit. Beautiful song. A lot of these albums by Chad and Jeremy, and then you'll see Peter and Gordon, which they're not the same, but in a way at the time, a lot of people maybe didn't realize which was one. They'd get they'd confuse them. Are you in Chad and Jeremy? No, I'm in Peter and Gordon. But their stuff was kind of heavily orchestrated, a little schmaltzy. But A Summer Song is a great thing. Willow Weep for Me, From a Window. Again, they're the ones that covered Lennon McCartney songs. So this is the best of. This is one of my favorite covers because it's very 60s graphic. They do September in the Rain, which is Everly Brothers' song. Girl from Ipanema. So they did a lot of these kind of Lemon Tree, folky, pop, schmaltzy songs. Four Strong Winds, which is a great Ian Tyson song, Canadian songwriter that Neil Young even covered. So these are kind of fun albums. But again, they're not great as fully realized albums. They're really more just a great series of collected songs. Almost like sticking a bunch of singles together. That's kind of a nice cover, right? I think that also people got them confused with Peter and Gordon because in both cases one member wore glasses and one didn't. Obviously getting on the psychedelic bandwagon. Did it work? I don't know. I'm really disappointed that a lot of these bands who were talented really all of a sudden, 65, maybe 66 the latest, they kind of dried up. They disappeared in terms of creatively making records. And then, of course, as I just said, Peter and Gordon. You know, can you tell the difference between Peter and Gordon and Chad and Jeremy? I'm sure some of you probably can. World Without Love, probably their biggest hit, written by Paul McCartney, Lennon McCartney, but Paul McCartney. Again, a black and white graphic cover. Look familiar? Maybe the different crop. 500 Miles that Peter, Paul, and Mary sang. And you might know it's Gordon Weller and Peter Asher. Peter Asher was the brother of the theatrical British actress Jane Asher, who was dating Paul McCartney in the 60s. And McCartney basically lived for a few years when he moved to London from Liverpool in the Asher's house in the attic. Peter Asher would later go on to be the A&R man for Apple Records, signing one of his first signings and first albums was James Taylor for Apple. And then he brought, after Apple collapsed, he brought James Taylor to Warner Brothers, and the rest is history. Produced most of his first James Taylor records, produced the biggest hits throughout the 70s of Linda Ronstadt, amongst other artists. Knight and Rusty Armor. They tried to get a little kind of creative. This was a big hit. Lady Godiva, I had the single too. In fact, I didn't get the album till a little later, but I bought the single right away. It was in a way a novelty song, but a beautiful song. When I Fall in Love, A Taste of Honey. Again, doing all the standards here. Love is a many splendored thing. But when you're how old was I? A 13, 14-year-old boy, and you buy this cover in the 60s. And then obviously a later edition. This is on the Starlight. This is a budget version of Capitol later of the best of Peter and Gordon. That has all the great songs. And then I can't show the British Invasion without showing the Dave Clark 5. Probably the second Beatles, the second biggest band right off the get-go of the British Invasions that did, in a way, single-wise, top of the charts, gave the Beatles somewhat of a run for the money. I have mono and stereo versions of all their records, bits and pieces. In a way, it's a great kind of rock and roll punky kind of song. Great rhythm, great drums. You know, I could go on and tell stories and the whole thing of Dave Clark himself, the drummer, who was quite the promoter that owned all the rights years later to their music, and in my opinion, kind of screwed some of the other artists. But actually, these are both mono copies, slightly different covers. That's why I kept them years later. Dave Clark 5 Return. They do Zippity Doo Dah too. So everyone, like, they fill their records with covers. Rumble. All these bands, 5x5. I think the Stones had, what, 4x4? So I'm not showing the Stones here. I'm not showing the Who. It's a little later. They're a little second wave band, 65, 66. But in London, Weekend in London. And they're another band, again, mono and stereo. They're another band that did a movie. Do I have it here? I don't actually, but they had a movie that was, what was it called? It was called Have a Wild Weekend. So they got on the Hard Day's Night bandwagon too, directed by John Boorman, who would later do Zardoz and Deliverance, and was a great director. I think that was his first record. Everybody Knows. Again, they have great, and the whole reissued period of time when CDs came out, he really screwed it up. There was a greatest hits. They never released the whole catalog on compact disc. There's no, except for I think one double album hits, there's never vinyl reissues. Not that a lot of people are clamoring for these early albums, but they could have done a series of CDs even, box sets and things. Because, that audience is dying out. Dave Clark 5, You Got What It Takes. They have a great single, great ballad. Mike Smith was the lead singer, and a great one called Because. But Dave Clark was quite the promoter. I'm going to end with, I'm not going to show all the records because that's, obviously one of my favorite bands. I've said that many times in my shows and my contests. But the Kinks, You Really Got Me. I'm showing them because they were, again, one of the early first bands in '64 as well. But their catalog deserves a video on its own. And again, I love this band. But you all know, God, You Really Got Me. I mean, that really was very different at that time. It's almost like 2, 3, 4 chords that Dave Davies wrote with his brother Ray Davis, excuse me. So, Beautiful Delilah, it's got a Stop Your Sobbing. Stop Your Sobbing is on here. It's a song that was wonderfully covered by the Pretenders late in the 70s. And Too Much Monkey Business, Bald-Headed Woman, Cadillac, You Really Got Me. So, again, Can't Go to Sleep. One of my favorite bands. So I think that's it for the little British invasion thing. There's so much you could talk about this. There's bands I missed, I know, artists I miss. But again, I think none of these videos are really definitive historical tours. They're just showcasing our record collections, records we have. And I don't see a lot of this kind of stuff shown. I mean, there's bits and pieces, to quote the Dave Clark 5. But thanks for watching. This is one of Mazzy's more serious videos where I didn't get funny at all. Maybe you like that better. Anyway, Mazzy loves you, and enjoy the music.